In the vast, sprawling heartland of America, where the golden fields of corn stretch to meet the endless sky, there exists a kind of quiet that can swallow a secret whole. For the residents of Lenexa, Kansas, in the summer of 1995, that quiet was shattered by a mystery that would haunt them for decades. Two best friends, barely on the cusp of adulthood, vanished from a place where they should have been safe, leaving behind a void that no amount of searching could ever fill. This is a true story, and for those who have lived through the pain of a loved one's disappearance, you know that the passage of time does little to heal a wound that never had a chance to close. And for those of you watching, where are you from? I invite you to share your thoughts and feelings about this case as we unravel a thread that has remained untouched for 30 years. We begin with the two boys at the center of this story, Ethan and Jacob. They were inseparable, bound by a friendship forged in the small-town simplicity of the Midwest. Ethan, at 17, was the more adventurous of the two. He had a mop of sun-bleached hair, a mischievous grin, and an old beat-up pickup truck that was his pride and joy. Jacob, a year younger, was the cautious one, with a quiet demeanor and a keen eye for detail. They spent their days as most teenage boys in the mid-90s did, listening to alternative rock on a crackling FM radio, working summer jobs to save up for an old car, and navigating the awkward dance of high school crushes and impending adulthood. Their world was small but full, defined by the familiar rhythm of life in a place where everyone knew everyone. The summer of '95 was no different. Their days were a blur of working at the local feed store, cruising the main street, and spending long, sun-soaked afternoons exploring the vast cornfields that bordered the town. These fields were more than just agriculture. They were their playground, a labyrinth of stalks and leaves that offered a perfect escape from the prying eyes of their parents. It was a place of secrets, adventures, and a shared sense of freedom. Their favorite spot was a small clearing near an old unused grain silo at the far edge of the farmer relic from an earlier time, a rusted giant looming over the landscape. They called it the castle, a fortress of solitude, where they would talk about their dreams, their fears, and the future that lay before them. The silo, with its peeling paint and ominous presence, seemed to hold its own secrets, an enduring landmark that watched over their youthful pursuits. Their parents, while sometimes worried, largely saw their friendship as a healthy and safe pastime. They knew the fields by heart, and the boys had a strict curfew. The farm belonged to old Mr. Henderson, a man who had known them since they were toddlers and trusted them to respect his land. On the evening of June 12, 1995, everything seemed perfectly normal. Ethan and Jacob finished their chores, grabbed some sodas from the local convenience store, and told their parents they were going for a drive. They promised to be back by 9, and their parents, accustomed to the routine, didn't think twice. But as the clock ticked past 9, then 10, and the phone remained silent, a cold knot of dread began to form in the pit of their stomachs. It was a feeling no parent ever wants to know, a silent alarm that screams something is terribly wrong. Their first call was to Mr. Henderson, who confirmed he had seen their truck earlier that evening near the silo but had not seen the boys. The next call was to the police, but as is often the case with teenagers, the initial response was a familiar refrain. They're probably just out with friends. They'll turn up, but their parents knew better. Ethan and Jacob were not the type of boys to run off without a word. The dread intensified, turning to panic as the minutes stretched into hours. By dawn, the fields that had once been their sanctuary had become a place of dread, a silent witness to a disappearance that would define a small town's history forever. And so, the search began, but the cornstalks gave up no secrets, and the only evidence left behind was a set of tire tracks leading into the field and a chilling silence. The days that followed were a blur of organized chaos and mounting despair. The town of Lenexa, Kansas, a place where people left their doors unlocked, quickly mobilized. Search parties, a mix of frantic family, concerned neighbors, and local law enforcement, fanned out across the vast, seemingly endless cornfields. It was a scene straight from a parent's worst nightmare. Dozens of people walking shoulder to shoulder, their eyes scanning the dense rows of green stalks, calling out the names of Ethan and Jacob, their voices swallowed by the wind. The hope that the boys were simply playing a prank, or had somehow gotten lost, faded with each passing hour. The initial search yielded nothing. The police, now taking the disappearance seriously, brought in canine units. The dogs, trained to pick up human scent, led investigators deep into the cornfield, tracing a path that ended abruptly near the old grain silo. It was the last confirmed location of the boys' truck, which had been found abandoned at the edge of the field the morning after they vanished. The vehicle was locked, and a quick inspection revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no note. The truck, a symbol of their freedom, had become a tomb of questions. It seemed as if the boys had simply gotten out and walked into the corn, never to be seen again. The disappearance became a national headline, a tragic story of two young boys swallowed by the heartland. News crews descended on Lenexa, their bright lights and intrusive questions a stark contrast to the town's quiet grief. The parents of Ethan and Jacob were thrust into the national spotlight, their private pain becoming a public spectacle. They gave interviews, their tear-filled pleas for information broadcasts across the country, hoping that someone, somewhere, had seen something. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing with them a new level of expertise, but even they were stumped. There were no suspects, no ransom demands, and no clear motive. The case was a complete mystery, a puzzle with 1,000 missing pieces. Theories began to circulate, fueled by a panicked community and the 24/7 news cycle. Some speculated they had been abducted by a drifter, a transient passing through the state on one of the nearby highways. Others whispered about a local predator, someone who knew the boys in the landscape, someone hiding in plain sight. There were also the darker, more conspiratorial theories. Had they been involved in something bigger, something dangerous? But none of these theories held up to scrutiny. Ethan and Jacob were good kids from stable homes. They had no known enemies and were not involved in any risky behavior. Their lives were an open book, and the pages had been abruptly torn out. As the summer turned to fall, the cornfields were harvested, leaving behind a barren landscape of dirt and stubble. The search continued, but the hope of finding them alive dwindled with each passing day. The police followed up on every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. They interviewed everyone who knew the boys, their friends, teachers, and neighbors. But the answers were always the same. They were good kids. I can't imagine who would want to hurt them. The case grew cold, a file gathering dust in a police station in Lenexa. The people of the town tried to move on, but the memory of the two missing boys hung over them like a permanent shadow. For Ethan and Jacob's families, the grief was a living entity, an agonizing constant that changed the course of their lives forever. They lived in a state of suspended animation, unable to truly grieve because there was no body to bury, no final goodbye to say. Every ringing phone, every strange car on the street, every fleeting glimpse of a boy with the same hair color or build would send their hearts racing. The grain silo, once a symbol of childhood adventure, became a monument to their loss, an empty sentinel standing guard over an unsolved mystery that had stolen their sons and their peace. The fields that had once represented freedom were now a permanent reminder of a horrifying question: what happened to Ethan and Jacob in the summer of 1995? As the weeks turned into months, the initial flurry of media attention and police activity slowed to a trickle, then to a halt. The missing posters, once a ubiquitous sight on every lamppost and storefront in Lenexa, faded in the sun, and were eventually torn down by rain and wind. The families of Ethan and Jacob were left alone with their grief and the gnawing frustration of a case with no leads. They hired private investigators, spent their life savings on billboards and reward money, and chased down every tip, no matter how outlandish. They were determined to keep the boys' memory alive, to prove that their sons were not just another cold case to be forgotten. But with each dead end, their hope was chipped away, replaced by a hollow ache that would never fully subside. The community, too, felt the lingering pain. The cornfields, once a symbol of the town's agricultural pride, now held a dark secret. Parents warned their children not to play in them, and the old grain silo, once a harmless curiosity, became an object of fear. The innocence of the small town was gone, replaced by a deep-seated paranoia. The idea that something so terrible could happen in their quiet, peaceful corner of the world was a difficult pill to swallow. People started locking their doors at night, and every stranger was viewed with suspicion. The disappearance of Ethan and Jacob had not only taken two boys, it had stolen the community's sense of security. The police department, despite their best efforts, had exhausted every available resource. The case file was massive, filled with countless reports, interviews, and lab results, yet it offered no path forward. Without a body, a witness, or a single piece of forensic evidence, there was nothing to build a case on. The lead detective, a veteran officer named John Miller, found himself haunted by the case. He had worked a number of homicides and missing persons cases in his career, but this one was different. It was the lack of anything that made it so chilling. It was as if the boys had simply ceased to exist, erased from the world without a trace. Miller would often drive past the cornfield on his way home, looking at the silent silo and the empty rows, his mind replaying the investigation over and over, searching for the one clue he might have missed. Years went by, the 90s turned into the new millennium. The world moved on, but for Ethan and Jacob's families, time stood still. Their parents aged, their hair turning gray with worry and sorrow. Anniversaries of the disappearance became somber, private rituals, a time to remember the boys as they were, full of life, laughter, and endless potential. Birthdays were especially hard, marking a year that their sons would never have the chance to experience. Their childhood bedrooms remained untouched, preserved as they were on that last summer night. The posters on the walls, the video game console, the books on the shelves all were frozen in time, silent reminders of the lives that had been tragically cut short. The case of the missing boys became a local legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones to new generations. People would point to the old cornfield and the desolate silo, telling the tale of the two friends who vanished without a trace. It was a cautionary tale, a permanent scar on the town's history. and as the decades passed, it seemed the mystery would forever remain unsolved. The world had all but forgotten Ethan and Jacob, but their families, and the few who still remembered them, continued to hold out a sliver of hope. A hope that one day, a piece of the puzzle would finally emerge, shattering the long silence and revealing the truth that had been buried for so long. Little did they know that the answer was not in a distant city, or a criminal's confession, but in the very soil of the place where the boys were last seen. For 3 decades, the town of Lenexa lived with the ghost of 2 missing boys. The old cornfield and the desolate grain silo stood as silent monuments to a cold case that had long been filed away, gathering dust. The families of Ethan and Jacob had aged, their hopes slowly giving way to a weary acceptance. Ethan's father, a once vibrant man, became quiet and withdrawn, spending his days tending to a garden that he rarely showed to anyone. Jacob's mother, a woman who had fought tirelessly for her son, now dedicated her time to helping other families with missing children. Her personal tragedy transformed into a public mission. They never stopped searching, but the search had become a part of their identity, a quiet act of remembrance rather than an act of pursuit. The world had largely forgotten them, but they could never forget. In the autumn of 2025, a storm of historic proportions swept through the Midwest. Hurricane-force winds and torrential rains battered the region for days, causing widespread flooding and damage. In the small town of Lenexa, the elements took their toll on the very landscape that had held a secret for so long. The old Henderson farm, now owned by a new, younger generation, was particularly hit hard. The fierce winds tore through the cornfield, flattening the stalks that had long since been harvested, and the relentless rain turned the soil into a muddy, unstable mess. But the most significant event occurred near the old grain silo. The structure, weakened by decades of rust and neglect, finally gave way. With a thunderous groan, its rusted steel and concrete base collapsed, sending a cascade of grain and debris tumbling down. The new owner, a man named Mark, went out the next morning to assess the damage. He was a practical man, more concerned with the cost of repairs than with local folklore. But as he surveyed the wreckage, he noticed something strange. The collapsing silo had not only created a crater of debris, but it also revealed a patch of earth that looked unnatural. It was a section of ground that had been protected from the elements by a thick layer of compacted, rotted grain. As he began to clear away the debris, a curious object caught his eye. Partially buried in the wet earth was what looked like a metal hatch, a small square piece of steel that had been bolted shut. It was completely out of place in the middle of a cornfield. Intrigued, Mark got a shovel and began to dig, carefully removing the dirt and grain that clung to the object. He was a lifelong resident of the area and had heard the stories of the 2 missing boys, but he never put much stock in them. He was about to write the discovery off as a weird piece of old farm equipment when he saw the padlock. It was rusted solid, its metal corroded to the point of being nearly unrecognizable, but it was unmistakably a padlock. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine. The hatch wasn't just a random piece of metal. It was a trapdoor, a sealed entry into something buried underground. Mark immediately called the local authorities. The initial dispatch operator was skeptical, but the mention of a possible hidden cellar on the Henderson farm was enough to warrant sending a patrol car. The officer who arrived quickly realized this was far from a simple curiosity. The rust and age of the trapdoor were undeniable, suggesting it had been there for a very, very long time. The officer called for backup, and within a few hours, the small field was once again buzzing with activity. But this time, it wasn't a search party. It was a team of forensic investigators and a collective sense of dread. The silence of 30 years was about to be broken, and the truth, whatever it was finally ready to emerge from the heart of the earth. The discovery of the trapdoor sent shockwaves through the community, a sudden jarring awakening from a long-dormant nightmare. For the families of Ethan and Jacob, the news was a cruel mix of dread and hope. 30 years of silence had conditioned them for disappointment, for the endless cycle of tips that led nowhere. But this was different. This was a physical object, a tangible lead, right where their sons had last been seen. They rushed to the scene, their hearts pounding with a terrifying mix of anticipation and terror. The police had already cordoned off the area, and a team of forensic experts was meticulously working to open the hatch. The rusted padlock was a major obstacle, its metal fused by years of exposure. But with the right tools, the team was finally able to pry it open. As the trapdoor slowly creaked open, an acrid, musty smell of damp earth and decay wafted up from the darkness below. A deep silence fell over the small crowd of onlookers. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions and a collective terrified breath. Using powerful lights, the investigators peered into the blackness. The hole was not deep, maybe 6 or 7 feet at most, and it led into a small, claustrophobic space. As the beams of light cut through the gloom, they revealed a small hand-dug chamber. The walls were uneven, shored up with old wooden planks, and the floor was made of packed dirt. The air was thick and heavy, and as the lights moved, they landed on a collection of strange objects. Inside the chamber, arranged with a disturbing sense of purpose, were several personal items that sent a jolt of recognition through everyone watching. There was a worn baseball glove, its leather cracked and faded. Next to it, a small, intricate model airplane, its wings broken and dusty. And in a corner, leaning against the wooden wall, was a vintage Walkman with a pair of headphones. The items were instantly recognizable. They were things Ethan and Jacob had loved, objects they had treasured, but the most chilling discovery was not an object at all. In the center of the chamber, a space had been cleared, and on the dirt floor, someone had meticulously arranged a collection of bones. The forensic team worked quickly, and with grim efficiency. They carefully documented and collected every bone, every object, and every piece of dirt from the chamber. The bones were a mix of animal and human, a disturbing jumble that left more questions than answers. The human remains were clearly not those of two boys. They were far older, a collection of miscellaneous bones that appeared to have been gathered from various sources and then placed here. It was a bizarre and unsettling discovery, but it wasn't the final one. As the investigators meticulously sifted through the dirt, a young forensic technician's gloved hand brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it from the earth, and as she held it up to the light, a gasp went through the crowd. It was an old, rusted metal box. The box was about the size of a shoebox, and it was also padlocked, though this lock was less corroded than the one on the trapdoor. It was clear that this box was meant to stay sealed, a secret buried within a secret. The police chief, a man who had been a rookie officer when the boys disappeared, ordered the box to be taken to the lab immediately. The families of Ethan and Jacob watched as the evidence was loaded into the van, their emotions a fragile mix of terror and a new, unsettling sense of hope. The bizarre findings in the underground chamber suggested something far more sinister than a simple abduction. The truth, buried for 3 decades, was not just about 2 missing boys. It was about something deeply disturbing, something that had been hidden in the heart of the Kansas cornfield all along. The small town of Lenexa, already on edge, watched the developments with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound unease. News of the mysterious trapdoor and the bizarre contents of the underground chamber spread like wildfire. The initial media frenzy that followed the boys' disappearance in 1995 was rekindled, this time with the added tension of a cold case that was suddenly very hot. The old detective, John Miller, now retired and living a quiet life, was the first one called. He arrived at the scene, a ghostly figure from the past, his face etched with a mix of shock and a decades-old sense of failure. He had spent years haunted by the case, and now, finally, there was a break. The metal box was the key. Back at the Kansas City Forensics Lab, a team of specialists carefully pried open the rusted container. The room was silent as they worked, every person holding their breath. Inside, tucked away in a series of sealed plastic bags, was a collection of unsettling items. The first was a small, dusty notebook, a diary. It was not Ethan's or Jacob's. The handwriting was neat and careful, and the dates went back to the late 1980s. The entries spoke of a young girl, about the same age the boys were when they vanished, named Sarah, a quiet, introspective girl who lived on a farm adjacent to the Henderson property. Her entries were full of a deep loneliness and a growing fear of her own father, a man described as a cruel and unforgiving tyrant. The next bag contained a set of old, well-preserved letters. They were addressed to Sarah and were from her uncle, a man who had moved away years ago. The tone of the letters was gentle and loving, a stark contrast to the life she described in her diary. The letters spoke of a family secret, a hidden truth that her father had kept locked away, and a plan to one day help her escape. The most disturbing item, however, was in the third bag. It was a small, rusted pair of metal shears, the kind used for cutting crops, but a closer look revealed dark, reddish-brown stains on the blades. Lab tests would later confirm the stains were blood, but the DNA was so degraded they couldn't get a match. The contents of the box were a devastating blow to the case's original narrative. The discovery wasn't about Ethan and Jacob's disappearance, at least not directly. It was about another tragic secret, an older mystery that had been buried in the same ground. The police now had 2 cold cases on their hands, and the connection between them was a terrifying puzzle. Was this a sick joke? Was it a clue left by a killer? Or was it something else entirely? They cross-referenced Sarah's name in their archives and found a missing persons report from 1989. A girl named Sarah had vanished from the very same farm, and her disappearance had been classified as a runaway case. The lead detective at the time, Miller's predecessor, had believed she had simply run away from her abusive home. The case was closed a year later. As the police delved into Sarah's diary, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Her entries became more desperate, her fear more palpable. On a specific date, July 2, 1989, she wrote of a hidden place her uncle had told her about, a trapdoor on the property. She described it as a way out, a secret escape route from her father. The final entry, scrawled hastily in the last few lines, was a cry for help. "He knows, I'm going to the hole. Uncle's key. He's coming." The entries ended there, and a single, faded fingerprint was found on the page. The police now realized the truth was far more intricate than they had ever imagined. The boy's disappearance was tied to an earlier, unsolved crime, a grim truth that had been hidden in the cornfields for more than 3 decades. The trapdoor was not just a hiding place, it was a grave, a secret sanctuary that became a tomb. But what did this all have to do with Ethan and Jacob? And what was the horrifying final secret that linked them all together? The police, armed with Sarah's diary, had a new, agonizing line of inquiry. They knew the remains found in the chamber were not those of Ethan and Jacob. The bones were a grisly collection, but they were older, and a full forensic analysis revealed a disturbing truth. The bones were not just from one person, but from multiple different individuals, all fragmented and scattered. It was a macabre discovery, suggesting the trapdoor wasn't a grave but a trophy room or a makeshift altar for some horrific ritual. The sheer depravity of it all made the seasoned detectives feel sick. It was clear that a deep, dark secret had been hidden in the heart of that cornfield for decades. The focus of the investigation now turned to Sarah's father, a man named Robert Henderson, the same Mr. Henderson who owned the farm where the boys disappeared. He had died in 2008, taking his secrets to the grave. His alibi for the night Sarah vanished had been flimsy, but the police at the time, believing it was a runaway case, had not pushed it. Now, with the diary as new evidence, they knew they had to dig deeper into the man's past. They found his old associates, his friends, and even an old farmhand who had worked for him for years. The picture that emerged was of a controlling, violent man with a reputation for a short temper and a deeply secretive nature. He was a man who, according to a former neighbor, had been obsessed with hiding things, with keeping his secrets locked away from the world. But the biggest question remained: what did this have to do with Ethan and Jacob? The diary was from 1989. The boys vanished in 1995. There was a 6-year gap. The police meticulously went through every line of the diary again, searching for a clue, a name, anything that could link the two cases. They found a few casual mentions of her father complaining about neighborhood kids trespassing on his property, but nothing specific. It wasn't until a young detective, a fan of old true crime cold cases, suggested a new theory that a chilling possibility began to emerge. The theory was simple but horrifying. What if the boys had stumbled upon the trapdoor? What if they had seen something they weren't supposed to see? The investigators re-interviewed the original detectives on the case, including John Miller. They learned that the boys' favorite spot was a clearing near the silo. It was a place where they would hide from the world, a secret sanctuary of their own. Could they have been exploring and found the hidden trapdoor? It was a plausible theory, but it didn't explain the lack of a struggle, or why their bodies were never found. The theory would have to be proven with evidence, and there was none, until a search of an old photo album, found in a box of evidence from Sarah's original case, yielded a critical detail. The photo was a blurry, faded image of Sarah as a young girl, standing in a field. She was holding a small, silver object in her hand. The photo's caption simply read, "Sarah with her secret key." The key was too small to make out clearly, but it was unique, with an intricate design. The police remembered the diary entry where she wrote about her uncle's key. It was clear that this key opened something important. The police then turned their attention back to the metal box, the one found in the trapdoor. It was not Ethan's or Jacob's, nor did it belong to Sarah. It was a plain, rectangular box, but something about it felt off. The investigation was now a race against time, and a 30-year-old mystery, with a single, tantalizing question. What was this secret key for, and was it the final piece of the puzzle that would reveal the terrifying truth about both disappearances? The rusted metal box, the one found buried alongside the chilling contents of Sarah's hidden room, was the only piece of the puzzle that didn't immediately fit. It was not Ethan's or Jacob's, nor did it seem to be a part of Sarah's life. But as the investigators meticulously examined it, a new detail came to light. The box was sealed not with a simple lock, but with a small circular latch. There was a tiny indentation on the side, almost invisible to the naked eye. It was a keyhole, but one so small and unique that it would require a very specific key to open it. The police immediately connected this to the photograph of Sarah holding her secret key. The key was the one thing missing from the trapdoor chamber. Sarah's diary spoke of it as a crucial part of her plan, a way to access her escape, but the key was never found. The theory that the boys, Ethan and Jacob, had somehow stumbled upon the trapdoor became more solid. What if in their youthful curiosity, they had not only found the trapdoor, but also the missing key? What if they had opened the box and discovered its contents? That would be a powerful motive for a killer to silence them. But what could be in that box that was worth 2 lives? The investigators, now a team of dedicated cold case detectives, began to look into the life of Robert Henderson with a new perspective. They scoured his financial records, his property deeds, and any documents they could find. A breakthrough came when they discovered an old family trust, a document from the 1980s that had been signed and sealed years before Sarah's disappearance. It was a simple, legalistic document, but a close reading of the text revealed a shocking truth. The trust, set up by Sarah's grandfather, was meant to be unlocked on her 21st birthday. It contained a massive inheritance, a fortune that had been amassed through decades of shrewd land deals and private investments. The trust stipulated that if Sarah were to disappear or die before her 21st birthday, the entire fortune would be transferred to her father, Robert. The motive was suddenly terrifyingly clear. Sarah didn't run away. She was likely murdered by her own father to gain control of her inheritance. The diary, the letters from her uncle, the hidden chamber, was all a desperate attempt to escape his control and to leave a record of his abuse. The bones in the chamber were likely a macabre collection of trophies from his life as a sadistic killer, but there was a missing piece to the puzzle. What was the key for why was the box hidden separately from the other items? And why was it so important that it would lead to a second, separate crime? The answer was found in a small, faded photograph taken at a family reunion in the early 90s. In the background of the photo, a young boy, a neighbor from the Henderson farm, was holding a small silver object in his hand. The object was the key, the same key that was in the photograph of Sarah. The boy was Ethan. It was a stunning revelation. The two boys hadn't just stumbled upon the trapdoor. They had likely found the key, opened the box, and were now in possession of the truth about Sarah's disappearance and her father's monstrous secret. They knew who Robert Henderson truly was. This new evidence painted a horrifying picture. The boys didn't just vanish into the cornfield, they were lured into a trap. Robert Henderson, realizing the boys had found the key to his greatest secret, had no choice but to silence them. He had a reputation to protect, a fortune to inherit, and a lifetime of secrets to keep buried. But where were the boys? The trapdoor was a horrifying clue, but it didn't solve the mystery of what happened to Ethan and Jacob. The truth was almost within reach. But the final, devastating act of this story was still locked away in the cornfields of Kansas. The pieces of the puzzle were finally fitting together, creating a chilling picture that spanned 3 decades. The police, now certain that Robert Henderson was a serial killer, connected to both Sarah's disappearance and the fate of Ethan and Jacob, re-examined every inch of the Henderson farm. They brought in new technology, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs to search the vast property one more time. The search was slow and painstaking, a final, desperate attempt to find the bodies that would prove their theory. They knew Robert was methodical. He would have buried them somewhere secret, somewhere he could keep his dark deeds hidden. The search led them to the most unlikely of places, the old, rusted grain silo itself. The silo, a looming relic of a bygone era, had collapsed during the storm, its contents spilling out and revealing the hidden trapdoor. But the police realized that the silo was more than just a landmark. It was a perfect hiding place, a place that no one would ever think to look inside. The silo had a small old grain elevator that was used to pull the grain up from the bottom to be distributed into the rest of the structure. It was the only part of the silo that had remained intact after the collapse. The forensic team, with a morbid sense of purpose, carefully began to dismantle the old elevator. The metal was rusted and brittle, and the process was slow. They had to be careful not to damage any potential evidence. As they worked, the air was filled with the smell of old rust and decay. The silence was broken only by the sound of their tools and the rhythmic thud of a crane lifting a piece of the structure. And then, as they removed the final rusted panel, they found them, lying at the very bottom of the grain elevator. A place so dark and so inaccessible that no one would ever think to look, were the remains of Ethan and Jacob. Their bodies had been compacted by the weight of the grain, their bones fragile, and their clothes tattered and faded. They were found exactly as they had disappeared, side by side, their arms interlocked in a final, tragic embrace. It was a heartbreaking sight. The two boys who had ventured out on a summer night full of hope and adventure had found their final resting place in the most unlikely of places, entombed by the very thing that defined their home, the corn. The forensics team worked for hours, carefully documenting and removing every bone, every piece of fabric, every shred of evidence. It was a grim, but necessary task. As they worked, they found one final, devastating piece of evidence. Clutched in Ethan's hand, its metal now corroded and black, was the small, unique key. The key to the box. The key to the truth. In a final, heartbreaking act of defiance, Ethan had held on to the evidence that would one day solve their murder and the murder of a young girl they had never met. The two boys had not only discovered a secret, they had given their lives to ensure that the truth would one day be revealed. The police now had everything they needed: the bodies of the boys, the murder weapon, the metal shears found in the trapdoor, the motive. The evidence was irrefutable. But the man who had committed the crimes was long dead, a silent specter in a cold case that had finally been solved. The news of the discovery and the identity of the killer sent a new wave of shock and grief through the town. The ghost of the missing boys was finally at rest, but the revelation of a local man, a neighbor, as a monster sent a chill down the spine of everyone who had known him. It was a final, painful lesson that evil can exist anywhere, even in the heart of America's quietest and most serene towns. The revelation of Robert Henderson as the killer brought a strange, unsettling closure to the town of Lenexa. The people who had known him as a quiet, reclusive farmer now saw him through a new, horrifying lens. He had been a monster hiding in plain sight, a man who had not only murdered his own daughter for financial gain, but had also silenced 2 innocent boys who had stumbled upon his secret. The truth, buried beneath layers of dirt and a town's collective grief, had finally come to light, and in doing so, it had changed the very fabric of the community. For the families of Ethan and Jacob, the news was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the decades of agonizing uncertainty were over. They finally had an answer. They knew what happened, where their sons were, and who was responsible. This knowledge, though painful, brought a measure of peace that they had been denied for 30 years. They could finally lay their sons to rest, giving them the burial they deserved. A final goodbye they never had the chance to say. The funeral was a somber, private affair, a ceremony that marked the end of a long, painful chapter. But the closure was not total. The knowledge that their sons had been killed by a neighbor, a man they had trusted, was a betrayal that would haunt them forever. The discovery also gave Sarah a voice she had been denied for decades. Her diary, her final words, and the small chamber she had created to hide her life's secrets were a testament to her courage. She had not been a runaway, but a victim, a young girl who had been silenced by a man she should have been able to trust. Her story was finally told, and her memory was honored. She was no longer just a missing person. She was a symbol of resilience, a young girl who, in her final moments, had fought to leave a record of her truth. The case of the two childhood friends who vanished in a cornfield became a permanent part of American true crime lore. It was a story about the fragility of innocence, the hidden evils that can lie beneath the surface of small-town tranquility, and the relentless passage of time. The old grain silo, now a shattered ruin, stood as a stark reminder of the secrets it had held for so long. The cornfields, which had once been a place of youthful adventure, were now a place of solemn reflection. A field of memories where a friendship had been tragically cut short, but where the truth had finally been unearthed. This story serves as a powerful reminder that some secrets are too dark to remain buried forever. And for those who have spent their lives fighting for answers, there is always hope. Because sometimes, when you think all is lost, a storm will come, and the earth will reveal a truth that has held for 30 years. A truth that was always waiting, just beneath the surface.